Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon with our team from the EPA, exploring the Indoor Air Plus version 2 program. We are so excited to have you all here. I remind everyone to please keep yourself muted, and if you have a question, please put it in the chat and we'll answer as we go along. And now I turn it over to our team. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Jenny. Hello, everyone. And yeah, welcome to this presentation. This is on Indoor Air Plus version 2. We're calling it Highlights and Opportunities for FIAS Partners. I'm Nick Hurst, and I work in EPA's Indoor Environments Division as the Indoor Air Plus Program Manager and the Chief Architect of version 2 of the construction specifications. And all of that I just said is true, except for the very last part about being Chief Architect. That is, I believe, the title of the recently retired Sam Rashkin of the Department of Energy, who was a mentor to probably thousands of us in the building science industry, including myself. And before we get started, I just want to give a quick nod to Sam, who, if I understand correctly, is now officially retired from DOE as of yesterday. Sam tried to retire last year, but we were blessed with one more year to have him in federal service. I exchanged a couple emails with DOE folks yesterday and didn't hear any response from Sam. So I think it's fair to say he's retired now, but he helped usher into existence the Energy Star for Homes certification program, but also DOE's Zero Energy Ready Home program. And in doing so, Sam had the foresight to see that builders really need a pathway and kind of a series of options to take steps toward a more high performance future. So why not figure out a way to link many of these programs, including both Indoor Air Plus and FIAS Plus, in a way that kind of lays out a path for the industry. So a big thank you to Sam for his vision and for creating opportunities for so many of us in the building industry. So I certainly cannot take full credit for being Chief Architect of Indoor Air Plus version 2, but I have two very bright people here today, along with a number of others at ICF and at Stephen Winter Associates, who have been helping to contribute to this effort to advance our program in the next decade ahead. So today I'm joined by Gayatri Vijayakumar and Carla Butterfield of Stephen Winter Associates. And I'll introduce them quickly. Gayatri is a mechanical engineer. She's got a deep background in energy modeling and high performance construction. She's been really instrumental as a consultant to EPA in both the development and the ongoing technical support for our Energy Star multifamily new construction program. And she's also been very active as the chair of ResNet's Standards Development Committee and is also a member of the ASHRAE 62.2 multifamily working group. So it's great to have her here. Carla is a sustainability director at Stephen Winter Associates. And when she's not doing industry training like this or some consultation for us at EPA, she's a very active FIAS verifier in the field. She's working with Energy Star, Indoor Air Plus, and FIAS, but also LEED and National Green Building Standard as well. So Carla also contributes to a number of high performance construction working groups, including EBA and others. So great to have both Carla and Gayatri here to share their experience along with our great support staff fielding questions from the industry. And one more note, if you're attending the webinar, you're looking for CEUs, there's that web address on the screen, and there will be a code provided at the end of the session as well. So with that, we'll move ahead. So as most of you probably know, FIAS Plus 2021 continues to have the Indoor Air Plus label as a co-requisite, along with certifications for both Energy Star and DOE Zero Energy Ready. So in today's webinar, we'll discuss the proposed timeline, the overall intent for Indoor Air Plus version 2, as well as some of those most significant changes that we think may impact FIAS stakeholders. We'll tell you how you can provide some additional input to EPA as we're continuing to make refinements in the coming months. And then at the very end of the presentation, we'll have a little bit about Indoor Air Plus marketing resources and some opportunities that builders and raters might be interested in as well. We hope to have some time for Q&A. We'll plan to stop about halfway through and take some questions, and then again at the end of the webinar. So we certainly plan to share these slides as well, so don't fret about that. But please take careful notes along the way and enter questions in the chat box throughout, and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can, again, halfway through and at the end. So here is an overview of how we are currently envisioning the process for the continued development and ultimately the implementation of version 2. Our first public comment period is open right now. It'll be open until March 17th, at which time we'll be reviewing that stakeholder feedback and making some refinements. And then moving ahead on that top arrow, we'll likely have a second comment period this summer after making some of those changes and updates. And we hope to have a final draft of version 2 this fall. along with some more details about updates to the overall certification structure and the quality assurance infrastructure as well. So moving to the second line, our hope is that we have that final set of specs in the fall for implementation late this year. And we recognize that FIAS Plus 2021 already includes Indoor Air Plus version 2 or names it effective in July. And the Indoor Air Plus version 2 timeline is a little behind this, of course. So the important thing to note is that now's the time to get familiar with the proposed version 2 specs so you can kind of hit the ground running with FIAS Plus 2021 projects as the Indoor Air Plus specs are finalized. Now for non-FIAS projects, we expect that the date for mandatory implementation for version 2 will not be until mid to late 2022. So we'll have 9 months to a year roughly for current Indoor Air Plus partners to kind of get familiar with the program, and ultimately it'll be required in late 22. So the key takeaway here, we have, we're trying to provide plenty of opportunity for the public to weigh in to help shape the future of this program. But now's the time to take a close look at the specs and offer some constructive comments. So we're of course coming out of a crazy unprecedented year in 2020. We still have many uncertainties ahead in 2021, but hopefully this gives you a snapshot of what our anticipated trajectory is right now. So what's new in version 2? Here's just a few high-level items. Indoor Air Plus version 1 has been available for buildings up to 5 stories in height. And we recognize that this has produced some challenges for FIAS projects in terms of the disconnect in program eligibility and labeling and co-marketing both programs. So with version 2, the intent is to bring the program eligibility into alignment, also with the Energy Star multifamily new construction program to be eligible for buildings of all heights. Secondly, Indoor Air Plus will be introducing a formal certification and quality assurance infrastructure similar to our other EPA programs like Energy Star and WaterSense New Homes. There will be some slight differences, of course, because of the slightly different approaches to technical requirements, but the intent is to have an overarching structure and certification for certification and QA that's similar. And we'll plan to introduce some additional training requirements for partners following the release of the final version 2 specifications. So in terms of the specs themselves, they will be in a similar format, largely with prescriptive requirements, but there will be, of course, a number of new requirements and some additional advisories. We'll talk more about them here in the next few slides. So before we get to those changes, we want to talk about kind of the overall intent. What's the intent of a version change? There's a number of reasons to go from one version to the next. This is the first big shift for Indoor Air Plus in over a decade. So we want to respond to some of the changes in the industry that have happened, incorporate some new research and involving best practices in building science. We want to be able to raise the bar after establishing a viable program. We've seen great growth in the last few years and significant interest and uptick over the last year as a result of the pandemic, which is great. But we think now is a good time to increase guidance and training for the industry, which is with those requirements for training that I mentioned earlier. The fifth and sixth things here is, one is we want to spur innovation where it's needed. You'll see that in some of the advisories that we'll talk about a little bit, where we think there might be gaps and places for building manufacturers and builders to improve and innovate in some areas. And ultimately, that last one is to bring more indoor air quality protections to homeowners and to occupants. So those are the primary goals. So how do we raise the bar? We are really using the same 3 key strategies that Indoor Air Plus version 1 was founded on: source control, ventilation, and filtration. And so when you get to the right-hand column and the kind of specifics of those 3 strategies, you'll see later on in this presentation that in the low emitting materials section, there'll be more product categories introduced. In the radon requirements, there'll be some increased rigor in each radon zone. There will also be a more focus on moisture control and an additional focus on relative humidity monitoring and dehumidification. Gayatri will talk about that when we get to HVAC. She'll also talk about ventilation, and this is a big one for Indoor Air Plus. We're trying to move towards more improved operation and potentially automation of ventilation systems, and trying to promote balanced strategies to reduce the shifts in pressure differential across the building envelope, which might introduce contaminants from places that we don't want them. That may not be a big challenge for FIAS partners. It may be a big challenge for other builders, but we certainly are open to your feedback on that too. And then the last one is filtration. When we can't keep the contaminants out with source control or ventilate them, we want to be able to improve capture, particularly of particulate matter, in both the recirculated airstream and in the ventilation air coming in. So those are some high-level updates. So what do the kind of the breakdown of the sections look like in Indoor Air Plus version 2? It's the same basically as it was in version 1, with one exception. Section 7 we've renamed Occupant Education, and we'll talk about that kind of at the very end of the presentation. So, as I mentioned earlier, the format will look similar but slightly different. The checklist itself will appear to be much longer than version 1. And this is in part because some of the Energy Star prerequisites have been incorporated now. So the checklist now represents all of the Indoor Air Plus requirements, not just the ones that are beyond Energy Star. The overlapping Energy Star requirements for moisture management are still clearly highlighted in gray in the checklist. And while those particular specs are essentially an Energy Star partnership requirement for the builder, Indoor Air Plus is incorporating them back into the checklist to help improve implementation and verification. We think this is going to be particularly important for FIAS Plus verifiers as well. Now, if we look closer at the moisture control section, here's a snapshot of it. You'll see that there are some of these items that can be verified either by the rater or the builder, and that's in an effort to help reduce the cost and the burden of verification. But the intent here is that these highlighted items are still not overlooked by the builder. The builder is still required to sign the checklist if any builder verified items are checked. And you'll note that there are some items that can only be rater verified, and an increasing number of items that can only be rater verified. These are the ones that EPA's felt are reasonable to include and to require in the scope of the rater's work. We feel this general approach kind of helps to build program integrity, but hopefully without significantly burdening the process for partners. So we hope especially that FIAS Plus verifiers will review the new checklist closely, and of course the details in the specs as well, but provide some feedback about that format and that approach through public comment. And again, that public comment period ends March 17th. So with that said, I'm going to pull in Carla for just a couple additional rater perspectives on this, and then she'll walk through some of the changes in section 1. Carla?
Thanks, Nick. As FIAS Plus raters and verifiers, we're used to our projects going through a rigorous plan review where the certified passive house design consultant has identified and commented on the water, thermal, air, and vapor control layers. It then becomes the verifier's job to be sure that those control layers are actually installed the way they're designed and specified. And we all know that conditions change, or they can change anyway, from design to construction. But the very nature of a passive house project means that we're used to verifying the moisture control requirements of the Indoor Air Plus checklist. However, version 2 has fewer options for the builder to verify a requirement. So this means the rater needs to do a little more field verification. There are some items that the rater will physically see on site, but others that might warrant virtual verification, like FaceTime inspections or photo documentation, especially with larger projects and multifamily construction, where some areas are being covered before others are even started. So before we dive into the moisture control requirements, a quick disclaimer. Given that this webinar is only 90 minutes long, we can't give you a full overview of all the IAP requirements that are in version 2. We're just focusing on those that have changed since version 1, which is what FIAS verifiers are familiar with and have been using to date. So when you see that we've skipped certain item numbers, that's the reason. However, if you're new to FIAS, there are links at the end of this webinar that will give you more information to become familiar with Indoor Air Plus version 1. All right, let's get into a high-level overview of the proposed requirements and clarifications in section 1, moisture control. In version 1 of Indoor Air Plus, site and foundation drainage were combined in this section. But in version 2, the proposed requirements are separated. The checklist and verification process remains streamlined, but as I mentioned, there are more rater verified items. For example, in version 1, a builder was allowed to verify all 6 checklist items in section 1, but version 2 requires that the rater verify 10 of the 20 items now in section 1. Just a note about our slide. The text in red font represents a new requirement or advisory in version 2. Previously, only required for radon zone 1, now all foundation drainage systems that discharge to daylight and are connected to the radon system must have a backwater or check valve. This is to ensure that soil gases are isolated. And item 1.3 clarifies a best practice that the floor drain in a basement or crawl space shall be located in the lowest area. A sump pit would meet this requirement if it also includes a trap drain in the lid. Both the sump cover and the floor drain requirements must be radar verified in version 2. Okay, here's a notable change in the water management section. Version 2 proposes to require a capillary break at the footing for new construction projects. This can be applied as a liquid, being either sprayed or painted on, or as an installed poly sheathing barrier. A capillary break at the footing will mitigate moisture migration up the stem wall and help to address durability as well as moisture management. So whether a full foundation or a slab on grade, a capillary break between the footing and the stem wall is required. This requirement can be builder verified to help reduce the number of site visits a rater would need to make during the slab and footing installations. When referring to the water control layer in the wall assembly section, EPA is shifting use of the term water resistive barrier instead of drainage plane to better align with other programs and commonly acceptable terminology in the industry. While there aren't any new proposed requirements in the water managed wall assembly section, there are some advisories to address durability, specifically to address best practice with water resistive barrier and rain screen assemblies. There are a variety of liquid and fluid applied WRBs as well as integrated sheathing systems on the market, especially in our high performing passive house projects. And with buildings of any story being eligible for Indoor Air Plus labeling with the Energy Star Multifamily New Construction Program as the foundation, it's important that these systems are correctly installed. That means membranes and sheathing systems with sealed and taped seams are applied on clean surfaces and in accordance with manufacturer's instructions. It might also mean more site inspections for larger projects where tape or sealant is left exposed for longer periods during construction. The second advisory is to install an integrated rain screen assembly. That means an air gap with a minimum of 3/16 of an inch or rain screen matting is recommended to be installed behind the cladding. The takeaway here is that while advisories are best practice and not required, they also may become requirements in the next version. For roof assemblies, the proposed requirements are to slope low or flat roofs for proper drainage and to insulate roof drains that go through the roof assembly. A detail like this is often part of a passive house design review, but can require a change in sequencing at installation and rater verification. EPA has also adopted a best practice that is not new to FEOS project teams. Version 2 proposes to require a fully integrated air barrier continuous from the exterior wall to the roof. Water control layers must overlap each other and roof penetrations must be fully integrated with the drainage plane, air sealed and fully flashed. Again, we're used to seeing this rigor of design and construction with passive house projects, but this is an important change for some builders who are new to adding Indoor Air Plus to their Energy Star certification projects. There is also an advisory for best practice at roof eaves, which builds upon an Energy Star and FEOS Plus requirement. The advisory is to install the roof membrane for a minimum 1 inch down the fascia before installing the drip edge. In version 2, the appliance drainage requirement has been moved from the HVAC section to the interior moisture section to help ensure moisture management is being addressed with condensate producing appliances and equipment. A drain pan is still required under condensate producing HVAC equipment and must still be connected to a drain. Additionally, non-vented dryers such as heat pump or condensing, which we see on a lot of our passive house projects, must be plumbed to a drain. And like HVAC equipment, hot water storage tanks must have a drain pan connected to a drain if they are located in or adjacent to finished spaces. And an advisory has been added to ensure buildings are dried out during construction by removing standing water and removing moisture by using fans or dehumidifiers and storing materials out of wet areas. EPA's intent here is to encourage builders to think ahead and take proactive steps to reduce the amount of bulk water that lands inside buildings during construction, which can help to reduce the risk of mold after the building is fully enclosed.
All right, thanks, Carla. Moving on to section 2 for radon. For homes that are shooting for passive house, radon resistant construction, or what we call RRNC, is one of those areas where we often have to strike a balance between our energy efficiency goals and our IAQ goals, because best practices for radon protection require that additional penetration in the building, and they sometimes requires an additional fan. So radon is that silent, odorless soil gas that leads to an estimated 21,000 lung cancer associated deaths annually in the US. And because of this, EPA has long recommended both for radon testing and for mitigation if a home tests higher than the EPA action level of 4 picocuries per liter. Now, over the years, EPA has developed some extensive guidance to help not only homeowners, but also home builders and radon practitioners. And a number of our staff in the Indoor Environments Division where I work have also been engaged with standard setting bodies such as the ARST Consortium. And that's in developing consensus-based standards for best practices. And that's for radon resistant construction, for radon testing, and also for mitigation. Now, in the context of Indoor Air Plus, we don't require full compliance with these standards yet, but we have a set of prescriptive measures that are generally aligned with these standards. And we highly recommend that builders check these out and become familiar with them. Now, in early 2020, ARST released updated versions of their new construction standards for low-rise buildings, and they actually separated them into 2 standards. The one that you see on the left is referred to as RRNC, and it essentially outlines the best practices for the installation of a radon rough-in, or what we commonly call a passive system. And the standard on the right is named CCAH, and that builds on the RRNC standard and then adds details about activating the system with a fan and testing. Again, we highly recommend checking these out. All of these standards are actually available to view for free on the web at the ARST website. Now, those standards we just discussed were designed primarily for 1 and 2 family dwellings. So what about multifamily? Well, there's the ANSI ARST CC 1000 standard, and that offers the industry's recommended best practice for the design and installation of radon systems in essentially any building that's intended for human occupancy, with the exception of those 1 and 2 family dwellings. Many of the principles are the same as in low-rise buildings, although there are some additional considerations here for large segmented foundations, also for the type and width of the riser pipe to use, as well as labeling and metering of electrical circuits for the radon fan. Now, Indoor Air Plus version 2 will, of course, include radon requirements for these buildings, depending on the radon zone where they're built. But in alignment with CC 1000, there will also be exceptions for multifamily buildings when all of the dwelling units are located above a garage space that also meets ventilation requirements according to Section 404 of the International Mechanical Code. Now, that sounds like a lot of words and text, but just note that there are some exceptions for multifamily buildings where there are ventilated garages. So in version 1 of Indoor Air Plus, we really only had one spec item in this section. It contained a number of important details for verification of a passive system, but in version 2, we're separating these items a bit. The first is to simply identify your radon zone and choose one of the strategies from this set of options. Previously, the only requirement was for homes or buildings in radon zone 1 to include a passive system. And what we've learned over the years from discussions with radon practitioners and professionals who do radon testing on a regular basis is that a passive system is great, but depending on the installation, it may only be effective roughly 50% of the time in keeping radon levels below the EPA action level of 4. So this is going to be dependent on a number of local details, of course, the geology surrounding the specific building site, the tightness of the building envelope, which is important, and then a number of other factors. But the only way to know for sure if you may have a radon problem is to test. We know that's not always common in new construction, but the one thing we know for certain is that in the vast majority of cases, taking a passive system and activating it with a fan is extremely likely to effectively reduce radon levels in homes that have issues. Now, although radon fans are generally very efficient and quiet, we know that there's still a marginal energy penalty with installing an active system. And we think the trade-off in health protections is worth it, but we also believe that providing builders with options is important. So, as you see on the screen, the new requirement proposed for homes in radon zone 1 is to include an active system, or do the passive system and test upon completion. We know again that some builders might be reticent to have their own homes tested, but we're seeing this actually beginning to enter the arena of building codes with Appendix F. And we think that both of these are good options to help protect those occupants in Radon Zone 1 who are most at risk. So moving on to Radon Zone 2, the proposed requirement now is to include a passive system or to test upon completion. Now, it's important to recognize that if you choose the testing option without including the passive system to begin with, it may be significantly more expensive to mitigate in the end, whether it's for the builder or ultimately the homeowner, especially in the case of some multifamily buildings. From our experience with single family homes, we're aware, at least anecdotally, that some builders in Radon Zone 2 have encountered issues where they built in like a quote unquote hotspot, and the homes that they built eventually tested high for radon. So that experience has led some of them to change their approach and to include basically the simple piping and the gravel under the slab from the very beginning. So we know that some partners in Zone 2 are considering this if they're not already doing it. And then finally, if you're building a home or a multifamily building in Radon Zone 3, you can either comply with one of those options above for Radon Zones 1 or 2, or simply provide the occupants with a Citizen's Guide to Radon. And this is a publication that's available freely on the EPA website. This way, they can at least be educated on those issues and the potential risks if they would ever have concerns, or if they would ever move to another home that may be in a higher radon zone. So this is one piece of occupant education, again, which we'll talk a little bit more about at the very end. That takes us through section 2, and I'll turn it back to Carla for section 3.
The rigor of air sealing to the Passive House standard gives us a good head start in keeping pests out of our buildings. Plus, section 4 of the Energy Star Radar Field Checklist covers much of the air sealing required in section 3 of the Indoor Air Plus pest barriers. But Indoor Air Plus version 2 also proposes to require a little more oversight from the verifier. The checklist verification items expanded from 1 in version 1 to 4 in version 2, and only 1 is allowed to be builder verified. To minimize pathways for pests, there are new proposed requirements for regions that are identified as moderate to heavy termite infestation areas. The following items are currently listed as advisories in Indoor Air Plus version 1, so they're not entirely new to the version 2 specification. These version 2 requirements include building with solid concrete or concrete-filled block foundation walls, providing slabs with welded wire fabric, and providing concrete walls with reinforcing rods. For heavy, very heavy termite regions, there are proposed additional requirements which include no plastic-based foam insulation under slabs or on exterior of below-grade walls. And if plastic-based foam is being used above grade on the exterior of the foundation walls, it must be covered with moisture-resistant, pest-proof material and be kept a minimum of 6 inches above the grade. Insulation on the interior of conditioned crawl space walls that are plastic-based foam must be kept a minimum of 3 inches below the sill plate. This is allowed to be builder verified on the checklist, which is in keeping with the idea that some of the below-grade items are hard for the verifier to see on site. And as a reminder, the dark shaded areas on the map are those that are affected by the very heavy termite infestation area requirements. Passive house projects, which require thermal bridging mitigation and often more insulation below grade to meet design requirements, will need to specify alternatives to plastic-based foam insulation in these regions. And while providing screens for operable windows may seem like good practice, it's not necessarily always followed through with. But in item 3.2, it is proposed as a requirement. And pest-proof screening on all ventilation terminations is also required, with the exception of clothes dryers. FEOS verifiers are on flat roofs during many phases of construction, but to verify screening on ventilation terminations, it might require a little more attention during design, specification, and installation, since this is an item which requires the rater to verify. We've received comments that there is some ambiguity about plumbing vent terminations. This is on our radar, and we intend to provide some more clarification on that in the next round of updates. Item 3.3 addresses pest management for multifamily projects. Multifamily projects will be required to include a pest management plan or have a contract with a pest management company. And it's proposed that trash or recycling rooms have a sanitary floor drain. Trash rooms are often adjacent to janitor closets or other common spaces with plumbing and floor drains. So this is a good practice that shouldn't be a heavy lift. But the takeaway here is to look for these drains in plans and specifications when doing reviews at design development.
All right, thank you, Carla. Before we move on, Nick and Carla have covered a lot of content so far, and we've got probably another 40 minutes or so of more content to cover. So just pausing a moment to check the chat box for any questions. Jenny answered a question about where the recording will be, and we will be sending out a PDF of all of these slides later. So if you do have a question or a comment on these first 3 sections, you can go ahead and type them into the chat. If you add the slide number or the section or the item number it was about, we can pull those slides back up. And we will have a second Q&A section after we get to the end of the rest of the slides. So if you have some, go ahead and put them in the chat box. Otherwise, we'll keep on moving. And thanks to Ken. Ken submitted a comment, so I am taking notes of the comments that are in the chat box. You can also submit them during public comment officially, but if you've put in a comment in the chat box, I am keeping track of those. All right, so moving on from moisture, radon, and pest to section 4, which is HVAC systems. In the next 15 or so slides, I'll show you the key changes in this section that are proposed for version 2 that push HVAC systems just a little bit further in order to improve indoor air quality. You all are already very familiar with pushing them to be as efficient as possible. Indoor Air Plus is trying to balance that efficiency goal with HVAC requirements that really improve indoor air quality, as well as occupant comfort. So at a very high level, some changes you will see compared to version 1 are that the number of required items in section 4 are up to 12 from 7. Some are for dwelling units only, but many will also apply to common spaces in multifamily buildings. And since some of you might work only on single family homes, and then some of you are focused more in the multifamily sector, just like Carla and Nick were doing in their slides, I'm going to clarify where requirements are different for those building types. And then finally, you'll see a distinction in some items between the terms HVAC and HAC to be more clear when requirements apply to just heating and cooling systems and when they also apply to ventilation systems. So let's get into each of those requirements. Just like in version 1, 4.1 is still addressing sizing and design of heating and cooling systems. But now it's talking about both dwelling units and also common spaces if it's multifamily. And I'll show those common space details on the next slide. So like Nick mentioned, these programs build off of each other. So just like in version 1, Indoor Air Plus version 2 still requires Energy Star certification, either single family new homes or multifamily new construction as applicable. And if you are familiar with Energy Star's Certified Homes program, it was just recently rebranded as the Single Family New Homes program, hence the SFNH on the slide, but is essentially the same program it used to be. So in terms of format, where the requirements are the same as Energy Star in the Indoor Air Plus spec, you will see them in italics at the beginning of each item. In these slides, we're just condensing them, but in the actual spec, you'll see a very clear section with these little check marks and italics at the top. So on the slide, you can see that Energy Star still requires load calcs for most ducted systems, but for some multifamily, no longer requires those to be done room by room. And where Indoor Air Plus proposes requirements beyond Energy Star, you'll again see that under a section labeled Additional Indoor Air Plus Requirements. So with that starting point, one of those additional requirements to Energy Star that Indoor Air Plus is proposing for version 2 that wasn't required in version 1 is that all dwelling units have their heating and cooling design loads calculated, regardless of system type, and there's no exemptions. And just a reminder, like Carla noted in the previous sections, throughout all these HVAC slides, the red text is used to highlight differences from version 1. So under version 1, if dwelling units were served by certain systems like mini splits or boilers, they were exempt from having those load calcs submitted, but there's still value in having those calculations in order to properly size the systems. So with this change in load calcs, version 2 is also proposing that those previously exempted systems also then follow manual S for system sizing. Now this is because occupant comfort is a key component of indoor air quality and is important in all dwelling units, regardless of the type of space conditioning system. and right-sized equipment is critical to achieving that comfort. So moving on to how this plays out in common spaces in multifamily buildings, anyone using version 2 of Indoor Air Plus will be following ENERGY STAR multifamily new construction for those buildings. Now, previously, ENERGY STAR certification wasn't a requirement for multifamily high-rise buildings seeking FIAS Plus certification. You just had to meet the requirements without actually getting certified. Since the release of the ENERGY STAR multifamily new construction program, multifamily buildings of all heights are covered within that program. And so now this becomes a mandatory requirement for FIAS Plus 2021. We will have a link at the end of this slide deck if you need more information on ENERGY STAR MFNC. But as a part of that program, in addition to reporting dwelling unit design, heating, and cooling loads in the ENERGY STAR HVAC design report, loads in common spaces must also be listed. Now, ENERGY STAR doesn't mandate a specific standard like Manual J, and they also don't set sizing limits for any of these common space systems. So with that as the new starting point for Indoor Air Plus, in version 2, one of the additional requirements to ENERGY STAR MFNC that is proposed for common spaces in multifamily buildings is to require a consistent standard for load calcs, which is ASHRAE Standard 183, a standard that's been required by Commercial Energy Code as far back as the 2009 IECC. Since ENERGY STAR also doesn't mandate how that common space equipment is sized and what oversizing limits apply, Indoor Air Plus is proposing for version 2 to have some guidance on sizing, with reasonable limits on system oversizing in those common spaces, again, using text from the IECC. Just like homes and apartments, common spaces with properly calculated loads and right-sized systems are just going to be more comfortable for the occupants, and that comfort is still an important aspect of achieving good indoor air quality in multifamily buildings. This next change is needed since boilers were previously exempt from sizing requirements, since it is common to have space heating boilers that also provide hot water. In single family or multifamily, some language was needed to accommodate that intentional oversizing. And finally, if you are familiar with version 1, when you look at the version 2 draft and wonder where the dehumidification requirements went, they weren't removed, they are just being moved into their own item, which we'll get to in a few slides. And so the key takeaway for meeting what is proposed for version 2 in item 4.1, you're going to need load calcs for all dwelling units and for common spaces, and all systems need to be properly sized to improve occupant comfort. Next item in section 4 is the same as it was in version 1, heating and cooling duct system design and installation. But we're talking about ducts in dwelling units and in common spaces. The base requirement is still what is required in ENERGY STAR, which is shown again in italics. If you work in multifamily, you will see some differences, like the ones shown here, due to changes in the ENERGY STAR MFNC program. The first change proposed in item 4.2 that is above and beyond ENERGY STAR and is different than version 1 is just adding language to help ensure that those in-unit test thresholds get met and continue to perform over time by listing critical locations for in-unit duct sealing and the types of products that are required to be used in order to create that long-lasting, durable seal. While some tapes are still permitted if used according to the listing, mastic systems are still recommended, and internal aerosol-based systems are permitted as well. Cloth duct tape, on the other hand, is not permitted to be used to seal duct seams in version 2, even if it would allow the duct system to pass the leakage test, since long-term durability is a concern here, not just passing a leakage test at one point in time. Now, just like equipment sizing, duct sizing is important to achieving comfort in both dwelling units and common spaces in multifamily buildings. And while ENERGY STAR MFNC, again, doesn't mandate a specific standard, Indoor Air Plus is proposing in version 2 to reference the ASHRAE Handbook of Fundamentals, since it's likely what the HVAC designer is using already. While version 1 allowed the choice between covering the ducts and vacuuming them out before installing the registers, version 2 requires both, recognizing that keeping the ducts fully covered is often not feasible at some stages of construction, and the ducts really should be verified to be clean before the building gets this label. So to summarize what is needed to meet version 2 for item 4.2, tight, clean ducts like you're used to from version 1 of Indoor Air Plus, but in common spaces as well as dwelling units, with sealing practices that are more likely to last beyond the duct blaster test. So moving on to item 4.3, which in version 1 really just talked about the very limited scenarios in which ductwork could be in assemblies adjacent to the garage. Now, some partners have asked, You know, what if my air handler is in a mechanical closet, but it's accessed from the garage? So in version 2, EPA hopes to clarify this. In these cases, the closet still has to be separated from the garage by a thermal and air barrier. So it's basically, you know, it's part of the conditioned space. And then the door to the closet must be insulated, gasketed, and have self-closing hinges. Now, this might not be a common practice for FIAS Plus certified homes. We're just flagging it here since we know the types of doors specified in many FIAS projects may be challenging to find with these self-closing hinges. And then the proposed text in version 2 will also be very clear that this is not an option in multifamily where dwelling units are adjacent to shared parking garages. So the next proposed change to item 4.3 basically builds off code and Energy Star requirements that require convenient access to filters and equipment. Indoor Air Plus requires that you verify the filters are clean and have the right MERV rating before certification. But again, that is just one point in time. We want the access to be convenient so that residents or a multifamily building owner is more likely to clean them, maintain them, and then replace those filters on a regular basis, even after they get certified. So this text here is just clarifying what it means to provide access to equipment, especially when it's in an attic, which can be the case in single family or multifamily. You know, a direct access or stairway of some type is definitely preferred, but if access is through a ceiling hatch or a scuttle, Indoor Air Plus wants to ensure that the filter can easily be reached using a common stepladder. So the biggest change to item 4.3 that's being proposed in version 2 is shown on this slide, but it's really not a big change for FIAS Plus, since you've been doing this to meet DOE's Zero Energy Ready Home requirements for some time now. Indoor Air Plus is proposing to adopt, in essence, those same requirements to bring all heating and cooling equipment and ductwork into the thermal and air barrier boundary, whether it serves dwelling units or common spaces. Now, the term HAC is used to be very clear that this does not apply to ventilation ductwork. So pretty much all the exceptions DOE allows, like the buried duct shown here, Indoor Air Plus will also allow in version 2. There is also an exception for makeup air units or dedicated outdoor air systems that you see often in multifamily that typically provide ventilation, but can sometimes also provide supplemental heating and cooling. Now, since those are generally rooftop units, that poses a significant design challenge to bring them into the thermal and air barrier boundary of the building, hence this exception. So to summarize these two slides, while it's a big change for Indoor Air Plus, it's not really a big change for your FIAS Plus project. Next item in this HVAC section is for pressure balanced bedrooms when served by ducted heating and cooling systems. Now, it looks a little complicated when you're looking at it in the spec, but it really is the same requirement you've been following if you've been certifying to Energy Star certified homes so far. Now, the reason it appears complicated is that Energy Star multifamily new construction only requires pressure testing in bedrooms when the supply airflow is 150 CFM or greater. And so you're going to see that that's listed in italics in the spec. Now, for Indoor Air Plus, you know, pressure balanced bedrooms is important for all size bedrooms. So this requirement gets added back in under that header for additional Indoor Air Plus requirements. And so the key takeaway is that for Indoor Air Plus certification in version 2, all bedrooms get tested for pressure balancing if served by a ducted heating or cooling system. This next item has been slightly reworded in version 2, so it now reads dwelling unit mechanical ventilation instead of whole dwelling, but it's basically addressing the same topic as it did in version 1. And again, it builds off the requirements already in place from Energy Star. So the big change proposed with version 2 is, again, a big change for Indoor Air Plus, but not for FIAS Plus. In version 2, Indoor Air Plus is proposing that dwelling unit ventilation be provided by a balanced system, not exhaust only, not supply only. This doesn't mean an ERV or HRV. And if you're in multifamily, it can be an in-unit system serving just one dwelling unit, or it can be part of a central ventilation system. And in alignment with FIAS Plus requirements, you can have a balanced system just as long as the measured airflows in the dwelling unit are within 10% or 10 CFM of each other. And you can have a balanced system if you are just using an exhaust bath fan that is paired with a supply system, such as one that connects to the air handler. The other key changes proposed are to have that supply of outdoor air in that balanced system be properly filtered using a MERV 13 filter. Now, in version 1, MERV-rated filters were just a requirement for heating and cooling ductwork, not ventilation systems. So this is a new requirement. Like the previous item, version 2 is also being very specific about making those filters and other components accessible, like in this photo. Also, the amount of outdoor air needed is being increased to be more in line with current ventilation standards. Indoor Air Plus recognizes that in some situations that supply airflow can be pretty tricky to measure, so other options to verify that flow are being proposed in version 2. And then finally, while not required, some advisories have been added to facilitate improved installation practices when it comes to ERVs, HRVs, and powered supply ventilation systems. The next aspect of ventilation relates to local exhaust. In version 1, this was all in one item. In version 2, Indoor Air Plus proposes to split it into 2 items, one for local exhaust in dwelling unit bathrooms and kitchens, and then another for common spaces and other types of exhaust. The core requirement in line with Energy Star is to meet the local exhaust rates required by ASHRAE 62.2, but inclusive of the alternatives Energy Star has already allowed for FEOS Plus projects. So as additional requirements, Indoor Air Plus is proposing for dwelling unit bathrooms that use intermittent exhaust rather than continuous, that the intermittent exhaust fan has some type of automatic controls, like the ones shown here, to ensure it operates long enough to actually reduce humidity and reduce the potential for future moisture and mold issues, which are key contributors of poor indoor air quality. Since continuous bath exhaust fans are always operating, no additional controls are required for continuous bath exhaust fans. Now, another great option that is increasingly common is to use a bath fan that has the controls integrated into the unit, like the one shown here, using either motion detection or humidity control. Now, this control requirement applies to all bathrooms that have a tub, shower, or spa, but not to toilet rooms or half baths or powder rooms. Requiring automated controls for kitchen exhaust fans, now that seemed like too big of a leap for version 2. It was okay for bathrooms, but not quite there yet for kitchens. The logic is definitely the same. So this is an advisory. We want the kitchen exhaust fans to actually be on when we're cooking if we really want to improve our indoor air quality. So for now, Indoor Air Plus is just proposing these smart range hood controls as an advisory. And finally, to improve the likelihood that occupants are going to actually turn these fans on and leave them on because they aren't too noisy, new maximum sound levels are being proposed for version 2 for both bath and kitchen exhaust. So a big change proposed for version 2 is to acknowledge what the current research shows, and it's that when we are cooking, we need to exhaust the pollutants that are being generated right at that time as quickly as possible and as close to the stove as possible. Now this is a big change. So it's only being proposed right now for single-family homes, duplexes, and townhouses, since it's generally feasible to have an intermittent range hood that vents directly to the outdoors. Indoor Air Plus recognizes that for multifamily, there are some additional considerations that can make intermittent kitchen exhaust less feasible. So while it's definitely still recommended to spec an intermittent kitchen exhaust in multifamily, in version 2, dwelling units in multifamily buildings will still be allowed to use continuous kitchen exhaust, and they will still be allowed to use exhaust rates of 25 CFM in accordance with the alternatives in Energy Star. Indoor Air Plus has also adopted the FEOS Plus requirement for the MERV-3 or washable filter and the requirement for a recirculating range hood to be installed over the range. So the only real change for FEOS is a slight change in how you calculate the minimum distance from the stove for the continuous fan or register, and this addition of a charcoal filter in that range hood. And this slide just shows a better visual of that change in the distance calculation. So instead of being a minimum of 6 feet from the cooktop, we're aligning with the UL 570 standard, which requires a continuous fan or register to be outside of a 45-degree angle from the stove, and still inside the kitchen, which you think would be fairly obvious, but this question about the location of a kitchen exhaust fan has been asked so much that it's been clarified in the Energy Star program. So this change results in it probably being located a little bit further away than just 6 feet from the cooktop. Now, version 2 also adds a few advisories to promote best practices that EPA anticipates will become standard in the future, but that aren't quite ready to be mandatory requirements just yet, like induction cooktops and certified range hoods. So the summary of the changes from these two slides are that if we really want good indoor air quality, we need our local exhaust fans to actually be local, and they need to operate when there's moisture or pollutants being generated. So this is that new item I mentioned a few slides back where version 2 proposes to separate common spaces and other exhaust systems from the dwelling unit local exhaust that we just talked about. So the biggest change for multifamily is not an indoor air plus change, but rather it comes about because of Energy Star multifamily new construction. And they have a base requirement to have minimum exhaust and outdoor ventilation in common spaces that meet ASHRAE 62.1. Now, Indoor Air Plus is adding to that a requirement for filtration, like we saw in item 4.5 for the dwelling unit ventilation system, so MERV 13 again. This next bullet was in version 1, and that requirement for vented dryers is staying, just noting here that the bit about condensing dryers was moved to section 1, as Carla mentioned, since it's not really related to exhaust. And then finally, Indoor Air Plus is proposing this new requirement in version 2 for maintaining this 10-foot minimum separation distance for central vacuum outlets, and also some advisories to run booster fans and makeup air provisions for vented dryers. So on this slide, item 4.8 now addresses what used to be 4.7, and it's also being expanded to ducted heating and cooling systems that serve common spaces in multifamily buildings, in addition to those serving dwelling units. Now the MERV rating is being proposed to increase from 8 to 13, which is the same as that new filter requirement in place for ventilation systems that we just saw on a previous slide. And like version 1, Indoor Air Plus still prohibits installing air cleaning equipment that intentionally produce ozone, but EPA is clarifying that electronic air cleaners can be used if they meet certain limits. While there isn't a requirement proposed for version 2 in item 4.9, it was important to Indoor Air Plus to clearly separate the non-ducted systems from the ducted systems, since they do have some limitations in providing filtration. So the advisory is there to help teams identify alternate options for air filtration, like standalone air cleaners or circulation fans with filters, when using boilers or mini splits or other non-ducted systems. EPA might make this advisory a full requirement in the future, but also hopes that filtration technology will improve in ductless mini splits, which are becoming increasingly popular in high-performance residential buildings like FIAS. So we're nearing the end of section 4, and as I mentioned, dehumidification, which was previously part of the requirements in 4.1, now has its own dedicated item. In version 2, Indoor Air Plus is proposing some new requirements, like in-unit humidity monitors or in multifamily remote monitoring using building management systems, as well as some modifications to the current requirements, like this change to the climate zones that require dehumidification and the types of systems that qualify. So recognizing that humidity control is not only important in the deep southeast of the country, Indoor Air Plus is proposing to expand this requirement to moist climate zones 1 through 4. Additionally, where there is not an actual dehumidifier installed, the alternative prescribed is to include variable capacity heating and cooling systems that use humidity sensors in the control algorithm. Now, it has been very challenging to write this requirement in a way that achieves the type of humidity control that is important in homes and buildings with the Indoor Air Plus label without fully requiring dedicated dehumidification systems. Now, we've been having discussions with HVAC manufacturers to understand what is available, and we continue to evaluate feasibility of certain products. One example we've been looking to are mini splits that have a manually operated dry mode. Now, these might not actually use humidity sensors as the control mechanism, so that can lead to overcooling as they try to dehumidify. So we're still kind of evaluating whether that dry mode feature in mini splits is going to be sufficient in meeting this requirement. And then another approach that we're kind of taking a look at is performance-based modeling, using the same building simulation software that you use for Energy Star. So if you're viewing this webinar, if you have some feedback on this topic, please be sure to submit those comments to us before March 17th. And with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Nick to wrap up section 4.
All right, thank you, Gayatri. There's a lot to tackle there. There's still a few items to come in HVAC. Item 4.11 and 4.12 are important as indoor air quality has really been increasing in importance, and especially as a result of the pandemic. There's been just increased attention towards air cleaning technologies in many forms, not just particle filters. So gas phase air filters, for example, They typically use activated carbon granules or some other type of sorbent media to remove odors, VOCs, and other pollutants, whether it's cooking byproducts, the building materials themselves, perfumes, et cetera. Now, there's also other types such as plasma or photocatalytic oxidation, and that's just to name a few. And then, of course, there's been growing interest in UVGI, right? Ultraviolet germicidal irradiation. And these are air cleaners that help kill or deactivate microorganisms such as viruses and bacteria and fungal spores. Now, there continues to be some debate about the benefits of gas phase air cleaners in the residential settings, but as well as the long-term kind of cost benefit of microbial disinfection generally. So nonetheless, EPA is recognizing that when they are properly used, air cleaners and HVAC filters can help reduce airborne contaminants, including viruses in these buildings. But by themselves, air cleaners or filters are not enough to protect people from exposure to the virus that causes COVID-19. Now, Indoor Air Plus is recognizing this in the context of version 2 by at least including line items in the specs, not with new requirements, but with some additional advisories. And again, these advisories may someday become requirements. So for instance, when UVGI lamps are installed in heating and cooling systems, access panels for the air handling units should be interlocked with an automatic shutoff mechanism to prevent accidental exposure to the UV radiation. And also an inspection window that blocks UV energy is recommended to be installed to be able to confirm from the outside that the lamp's operating. Now, as the science and the body of knowledge continues to grow with respect to virus transmission and air cleaning technologies, we anticipate that some additional guidance and potentially future requirements will also emerge in the context of Indoor Air Plus. But for now, Indoor Air Plus continues to include simply a prohibition on devices that intentionally use ozone to treat the air. We refer to those as ozone generators. There's a lot of additional information on EPA's website about various types of air cleaners that are available, both for in-duct applications as well as portable air cleaners. And we continue to update our website with information on indoor air and the coronavirus, as well as a number of FAQs on ventilation, filtration, wildfires, et cetera. So be sure to check out those links as well. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Carla, and she's going to walk through section 5.
Whew, that was a lot of great information about the proposed HVAC section, and it's a really nice segue into the combustion pollutant control section. First of all, the phrase within conditioned space is being updated to within the building's pressure boundary to be more exact and to better align with real life conditions. For instance, you could have a piece of equipment in a sealed insulated attic that's not actively conditioned, but is within the pressure boundary. And with the addition of multifamily buildings of all stories in version 2, there are even more conditions where the pressure boundary is the better way to define the areas concerning the placement of combustion equipment and appliances. Combustion pollution is very serious, and while it's prohibited in some programs, such as Living Building Challenge and FIAS Plus Source Zero, there is no prohibition against combustion appliances or equipment in the version 2 specification. However, all of the items in section 5 of the checklist are required to be radar verified. In 5.1, with the exception of cooking appliances, no unvented combustion appliances are allowed to be installed in any building type. This includes single-family, attached housing, and multifamily buildings, including in common areas and community spaces. And in all climate zones, previously climate zones 1 through 3 were exempt, only mechanically drafted or direct vent equipment is allowed within the building's pressure boundary. Another big change in version 2 is for solid fuel burning appliances like wood or pellet stoves or fireplaces. A monitoring device capable of monitoring CO2 levels and particulate matter as small as 2.5 microns or PM2.5 must be provided if solid fuel burning appliances are installed. If the limits are exceeded, the device must be able to alert occupants either with an onboard digital display or a web-based app. So the key takeaway here is if the project team is insistent upon installing the solid fuel burning appliance, they must also install an air quality monitoring device. The placement of carbon monoxide alarms has also been better clarified with reference to the National Fire Protection Association in item 5.2. And there is a proposed requirement that all carbon monoxide alarms have a minimum warranty and contain sealed, non-replaceable batteries. Many passive house projects are all electric, but even without installed combustion appliances, carbon monoxide alarms are still required. The takeaway here is that we need to do a thorough review during the design phase to ensure these requirements are in the plans and specifications, as well as conducting our typical field verification. In item 5.3, the tobacco smoke prohibition now applies to multifamily buildings with 3 or more attached dwelling units. And there is an advisory to inform on the dangers of harmful products such as smoking any substance, not just tobacco, and on the harmful effects of vaping and burning candles or incense. The second advisory expands upon the tobacco smoke prohibition to include the entire building, meaning inside residential units, not just the common areas. Passive house projects are defined by their tight envelopes and very low air infiltration thresholds. Controlling air infiltration and exfiltration not only reduces energy consumption, but helps ensure good indoor air quality because the pathway for air leaking into our buildings is usually through below-grade spaces or framing cavities where it can move gases, fine particulates, chemicals, and moisture into our living space. Stopping exposure to these harmful contaminants starts with reducing infiltration. Then we can move on to good ventilation and filtration. But until Energy Star multifamily new construction rolled out with the 0.30 CFM 50 per square foot of enclosure threshold, there hasn't been an Energy Star or Indoor Air Plus requirement for air infiltration limits. However, in version 2, EPA proposes to require all attached units achieve 0.23 CFM 50 per square foot of enclosure. That includes duplexes, attached homes, and apartments. And the proposed requirement for single-family homes is an air infiltration threshold of no greater than 3 air changes per hour at 50 pascals, which aligns with code but is significantly higher than the FIAS plus 0.6 ACH 50 requirement. Separating attached garages and parking structures from the building's pressure boundary is extremely important, even vital to good indoor air quality. Now, EPA intends to improve upon those indoor air quality protections for single-family homes, duplexes, and townhouses that have attached garages. Air sealing at the garage connection is still required and radar verified, as is the gasketing, weather stripping, and those self-closing hinges that Gayatri mentioned on the door from the garage into the living space. However, the new proposed requirement is to either include a 100 CFM radar verified exhaust fan or to verify the house-to-garage separation through a zonal pressure test. This test is the same as the previous option for homes that use exhaust-only ventilation, so many raters are probably already familiar with it. When certifying under Energy Star multifamily new construction, if you sample the compartmentalization testing, your test set must include a minimum of 20% of the units adjacent to the garage. And if exhaust is installed, it must run continuously or have carbon monoxide and nitrogen dioxide sensors. So we have some big proposed changes in Section 5 to help address occupant exposure to the harmful particulates and gases from the combustion process.
All right. Thank you, Carla. That brings us to Section 6. And now that we're largely done with the switching back and forth, I think I'll try to turn my camera on again and take us the rest of the way to the end of the specs. So that was a great summary of combustion pollutants. We're going to move into Section 6, low emission materials. And this is yet another source control strategy. The materials that we bring into our home, whether they're during the construction process or after the homeowner moves in, they will have an impact on the indoor environment. And it's largely through the introduction of VOCs and formaldehyde. It's important to note that just because you build an indoor air plus home and you use paint that claims to be no VOC, it doesn't mean that the home is going to be free of VOCs or contaminant free. We try to emphasize that to home builders. It doesn't guarantee that the home won't have any health risks related to chemicals. And we know that there are some individuals who have chemical sensitivities that might be more impacted by certain materials than others. We also know that in general, reducing the levels of VOCs and formaldehyde and those other known contaminants can help improve IAQ for those occupants. So there's two primary ways that we approach this. One is a content-based approach, where you typically see grams per liter of VOCs on the package. While VOC content is important, it may not necessarily address the VOCs of concern for indoor air. So the other approach is an emissions-based approach. That's based on product emission testing. So if you hold that thought, we'll talk a little bit more about both of those in the next few slides here. So with item 6.1, these are essentially, there are essentially no new requirements here. The reason is that about 2 years ago, EPA's formaldehyde standards for composite wood products under TSCA Title VI, that's the Toxic Substances Control Act, it went into effect, and those are now essentially the law of the land. So those listed composite wood products that are manufactured, sold, and imported to the US, they must now meet those limits. So if you recall, those were the same limits previously established by CARB under CARB Phase 2, which is currently referenced in IAP version 1. And so we plan to remove previous references to those other standards in this section, but we'll keep this spec item intact for now for composite wood. But the key takeaway here is builders should be able to easily find composite wood products that are labeled TSCA Title VI compliant. So that's great news for all of us, hopefully. In item 6.2, we're dealing with paints, finishes, and coatings. And if you've worked with Indoor Plus before, you'll recall a variety of different certifications and standards that could be used to meet the IAP requirements here. And moving forward, we intend to simply reference the underlying emissions and content-based standards that underpin many of those third-party certifications that are on the market. So the document that you see on the screen is the California Department of Public Health standard method. This is a standard for emission testing using environmental chambers. And this was updated in 2017 to version 1.2, and we hope to have that serve as the underlying criteria for a lot of the low emission material requirements for Indoor Air Plus moving forward. Now, in addition, IAP is proposing that paints, coatings also meet the VOC content limits identified by either South Coast Air Quality Management District or by CARB, the California Air Resources Board. So that's 6.2. Moving into carpets and cushions, we're again proposing compliance with the CDPH standard. And for anyone who's worked with Indoor Air Plus before, you'll remember the Green Label Plus certification. It uses this standard in their criteria. So in practice, this isn't really a change for current builder partners. Item 6.4 is one of those items that wasn't part of the very original Indoor Air Plus construction specifications, but as low emission adhesives and sealants became more prominent in the market, this item was added as an advisory in version 1. And so moving forward in version 2, we're proposing to move this to a full requirement, that these products meet both the CDPH standard method for emissions and the VOC limits from South Coast. 6.5 is another similar advisory in V1, which we're now proposing as a requirement in V2. And again, this is requiring emission testing under CDPH standard method, and we'll remove all the other standards that were previously referenced in this advisory in V1. In this product category, there will be numerous exceptions for inherently non-emitting materials such as stone, ceramic tile, glass, concrete, etc. And that brings us to two new product categories for gypsum board and insulation. And in both cases, Indoor Air Plus is proposing that at least 90% of these materials meet the emissions testing criteria under CDPH version 1.2. And for insulation, this applies to materials that are installed in wall, floor, or ceiling cavities, but there will be some noted exceptions for materials installed to the exterior of the sheathing, as well as for pipe insulation. Now, as we enter the next few months here of public comment and refinements, we are looking forward to reviewing any questions that arise from the home building industry and from manufacturers specifically about these proposed requirements and the new product categories. We've already been asked a number of times, how will we know for sure that our products meet these standards, and what will happen to that Indoor Air Plus low emission product guide that we love so much? We do intend to update that guide when version 2 is finalized, to offer some additional resources and background and some suggestions for finding compliant products. But in the meantime, we think the vetting and selection process for the builder is still very similar to version 1. We want builders to weigh in on this, but builders and raters will simply need to work together on the front end to confirm with their product suppliers that those paints, those caulks, those flooring materials, any of those other listed building products, that they meet those VOC emissions and or content criteria. So that wraps up section 6, and that brings us to section 7. And I mentioned previously that we're planning to change this from what used to be called home commissioning to occupant education. And that term commissioning is one that we feel might actually fit a little better in the multifamily space than in the low-rise and single-family homes. But we felt that some of the items that were there, such as the final verification of filters and the requirement to ventilate after material installation, they fit better into other sections of the spec anyway. So we're moving those and simply simplifying this to just one requirement, and that's providing an owner and resident information kit. Now, this kit might look a little different from single-family homes to multifamily buildings. In owner-occupied properties, for example, we want the owner to have all the instruction manuals for any heating and cooling systems, any ventilation systems, dehumidifiers, radon systems, and combustion appliances. Those things might not be provided to tenants in multifamily buildings, obviously, but they should definitely be provided to either the building owner or the property manager. And then additionally, we want to make sure that the occupants are given a suggested schedule for any necessary maintenance, filter changes, et cetera, to keep their home healthy and to keep their equipment functioning properly. And again, this is most critical for owner-occupied homes and apartments. Now I'll turn it over to Gayatri for a recap.
All right. Yes. Thank you, Nick, for that overview of section 6 and 7. I know we've only got about 20 minutes left. We've covered all these sections and we're just wrapping things up before we take some final questions. I want to just quickly condense all this information for our attendees today by doing a recap of just the key changes compared to version 1 that you weren't already doing to meet Zero Energy Ready Homes or FIAS. So this slide here lists some key changes that apply to all building types if you're looking to certify to Indoor Air Plus version 2 as part of FIAS Plus 2021 certification. And then the next 2 slides will have changes specific to building type. Now, taking them bullet by bullet, Nick mentioned earlier today that you might want to check on projects in Radon Zone 2 to see whether passive system or testing is going to work for your FIAS Plus 2021 project. Carla mentioned some changes to insulation selection in section 3 that you might also want to take a look at. The dwelling unit ventilation rates are increasing slightly in section 4, like I mentioned. Now, these are typically about 50 or 60% increase over the rates required previously by ASHRAE 62-2010. While most FIAS Plus 2021 projects are likely going to continue using continuous bath exhaust, in bathrooms where those fans are intermittent, they do require some extra controls. For ducted heating and cooling systems, MERV 13 replaces the current MERV 8 requirement, and it's now expanded to include ventilation systems. I'm going to proactively answer a question that's in the chat box. That bypass, we do want those filters to be accessible, but we also want to avoid bypass. So we want them to be somewhat sealed. That is a requirement in Energy Star for the heating and cooling systems, but Indoor Air Plus doesn't tack on another gasketing requirement to the ventilation MERV 13 filter. The next bullet, monitoring for relative humidity, is new, and some of your projects may now fall into a climate zone where dehumidification requirements apply that didn't apply before. And then finally, last bullet, if installing a solid fuel burning appliance, you must install a monitoring device for PM 2.5 and carbon dioxide. And I copied down that comment from the chat box about making that have an audible alarm as well. So thanks for that input. So on this slide, we are looking at some changes that are specific to certain types of buildings. Now, we expect that intermittent kitchen exhaust is going to be a big change for some single family homes, but just remember that it doesn't apply to multifamily. And one of the other questions in the chat box was about, is there a distinction between gas stoves and electric stoves? And the answer is no to that. The requirements are agnostic on the fuel type for the stove. And also the other question was, do you want those to run whenever the gas stove is on? And that is definitely the advisory. We definitely want to recommend that the stove, when the stove's operating, the fan is operating, but it's not a requirement currently to have automated controls that ensure that will happen. This bottom section is for any type of attached home, duplexes, townhomes, apartments. If it's attached to another unit, the big change here is reducing the air leakage from 0.3 CFM50 per square foot to the 0.23. And just making sure when you choose units for your test sample, like Carla mentioned, you want to intentionally include those that are attached to shared parking garages. And I think I have one final slide on multifamily. So just recapping, again, besides the biggest change, which is just kind of broadening the eligibility. So now we're not worried about building height. All buildings, regardless of height, all multifamily are eligible for certification now. And then the common space requirements are definitely much more clear in this version 2. Some of the key changes are the floor drains, like Carla mentioned back in section 3. Like I mentioned, the calculation and the reporting of heating and cooling design loads in common spaces, that's going to be a change. And then that last one about the kitchen exhaust, not so much of a big change, just a minor change in how you calculate the distance from the stove. Back to you, Nick.
All right, thanks, Gayatri. So that covers the majority of the proposed changes to Indoor Plus version 2. And if you're new to the program, hopefully this graphic helps you visualize how Indoor Plus is integrated with numerous other high performance building programs, including FIAS. It's not only a prerequisite for DOE's Zero Energy Ready Homes program and for Passive House, but it's referenced by a number of national green building programs as kind of a benchmark for IAQ practices. And there's a lot of those practices and optional items that can be taken within LEED and GBS Enterprise Green to meet Indoor Plus as well. One important thing to note for raters and providers is that just because Indoor Plus is a prerequisite for those other programs, the home still needs to be reported as Indoor Air Plus specifically in the rating software and then confirmed through EPA's quarterly reporting process. And that's for both Energy Star and Indoor Air Plus. This is important for builders and for raters for purposes of awards, for public recognition on our partner locator. And of course, it helps us accurately track program activity and uptake. Just a few quick notes on other resources and tools you might look into. Of course, every Indoor Air Plus partner has access to partner logos and a number of sales and marketing resources. There's co-brandable brochures where you can insert your own logo or some additional information about your company within the brochure itself. Whether you use them as handouts physically or even just digitally, if you use them on your website or in a sales model, a digital screen or something. The other opportunities, of course, are listed on our partner locator. And for builders who commit to 100% Indoor Air Plus, if you're doing 100% FIAS homes, why not commit to Indoor Air Plus 100% and you earn that additional designation as well. Just as far as training and technical resources, there's a number of great links here. Again, these will come to you in the form of the slide deck when you receive that. But just to highlight a few of them, the Building America Solution Center that the Department of Energy hosts is a great resource for a lot of technical resources on a number of federal labeling programs, including Indoor Air Plus. We also have some technical bulletins on our website that have been coming out over the last year or so. If you're interested more in radon, there's a radon webinar on our website specifically talking about some of the changes over the last couple of years. And then if you want some more background about multifamily new construction, which Gayatri alluded to earlier, there's 2 great webinars there, an introduction to Energy Star MFNC and a deep dive. So check those out as well. For those partners who have been kind of consistently not only building Indoor Air Plus, but doing a great job of using those marketing materials and promoting indoor air quality and the Indoor Air Plus brand to their home buyers, we have an annual leader award process. That process is going to be firing up here in the next month or so as well. And you can see the 2020 leader award winners for the builders on the left there and the raters on the right. The last few years, we've been doing a ceremony in conjunction with the EPA High Performance Home Summit. This past year was virtual, of course, due to the pandemic, but you can see a link there on the slide to actually go back and check that out if you're interested and check out the leader award profiles on our EPA website. So here is some contact information for our program. Of course, the homepage and the Indoor Air Plus inbox where you can, again, send public comment. And I'm going to end with a slide that shows you, of course, your reporting code for CEUs for this event, but also the specific Indoor Air Plus website link that'll take you to the proposed version 2 specs and that public comment template. And again, that public comment period first public comment period is ending March 17th. The more we get in this first round for public feedback, the better we can make this program and the quicker we can tie things up to move the program forward with version 2. So with that,